When my husband Harold slipped away from our club luncheon, my intuition screamed. In a secluded corner of the park, I saw the impossible, a ghost from Harold's youth, breathing and alive. The young stranger carried his face like a stolen mask. 50 years of marriage flashed before my eyes, every business trip now tasting like ash. Harold tells everyone I'm suffering from delusions, but the only lie here is the one he's been living. Listen to the end to hear how I handled it, and subscribe to hear more of my journey. The crystal salad plate didn't shatter so much as announce itself, a sharp, percussive crack against the country club's marble floor that made every coiffed head in the room swivel toward the sound. But it wasn't the plate that stopped my heart. It was the sound of Harold's chair. That scrape of heavy mahogany against polished stone cut through the tinkling of fine china and the languid hum of the dining room like a blade. 50 years. 50 years of protocol exists for a reason, his words, spoken back to me whenever I suggested deviation from the social contract we'd built our lives on. 50 years of arriving precisely at noon, of staying precisely through dessert and one round of goodbyes, of never, ever abandoning a table mid-toast. And yet there he was. Harold stood, his gold Cartier tank, the twin of mine, a gift from better days, pressed against the pale underside of his wrist. His face was a mask I didn't recognize. Not the polished Texas charm he'd worn in that room since before most of these women could walk. Something raw. Something jagged. A vein I'd never seen pulsed once at his temple. Emergency at the office, Evelyn. He didn't look at me when he said it. In 50 years, he had never failed to look at me when he spoke my name. He turned on his heel, and the sunlit dining room, all the clinking bone china and jasmine-scented air and carefully arranged social performances, fell into a suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums like water. I felt every pair of eyes in the room perform the same slow, polite pivot from Harold's retreating back to my face. I smoothed my wool skirt once, the gesture as automatic as breathing. My social smile did not waver. I reached for my water glass, took a small, deliberate sip, and set it back on its ring with perfect precision. Then I folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and rose. I didn't apologize. I don't apologize for other people's catastrophes. The side terrace was bright and hot, the Texas sun pressing down on the sandstone like a flat iron. I caught the tail of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and cedar, the same bottle for 30 years, drifting toward the parking structure, and I followed it with the unhurried pace of a woman who has nowhere pressing to be. My Continental was in the second row. The engine caught with a low, discreet purr that I have always found more satisfying than most conversations. I let Harold's silver Cadillac pull out of the lot, watched it turn left toward the older, shadowed part of the city, and counted to 15 before I followed. 2 cars between us. Always 2. My father taught me that. I kept my hands steady on the leather-wrapped wheel. Outwardly, I was simply a well-dressed woman of a certain age on a Tuesday afternoon drive. Inwardly, the catalog was already opening, the great mental ledger I've kept since I was 17 years old, the one that records every anomaly, every deviation, everything that should not be and is. Harold did not go to the office after sudden emergencies. Harold called and delegated. Harold had not personally set foot in a Permian Basin office in 7 years. I reached up and touched my pearls. Triple Strand South Sea, my grandmother's. They lay against my collarbone with their familiar, cool weight, and for just a moment they felt less like heirloom jewelry and more like a hand around my throat. I kept driving. He parked on Allen Parkway and walked into Memorial Park on foot, which told me 2 things. He'd scouted the approach, and he didn't want his car seen. I pulled onto a side street 1 block north and killed the engine. The heat hit me the moment I opened the door, that heavy, botanical Texas humidity that smells of cut grass and distant rain and something older underneath. I have never been the kind of woman who cares about her hair, but I was aware, in a distant and mildly irritating way, that the silver bob I'd had set Wednesday morning would begin to lose its discipline within the hour. I moved anyway. The old stone monuments along the park's eastern path gave me cover. I stayed behind the largest one, a weathered limestone marker that smelled of lichen and heat, and looked through the canopy of live oaks toward a secluded bench near the bayou. Harold sat hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, in a posture I had never once seen him adopt in private, let alone public. Harold did not hunch. Harold presided. And facing him, the young man was perhaps 25. He wore a cheap suit that pulled slightly at the shoulders, and he stood with his weight distributed exactly as Harold stood, heels slightly apart, chest forward, chin tilted up at an angle that communicated, without a word being spoken, that the sidewalk was his by divine right. I had watched that posture win oil leases in 1982. I had watched it intimidate boardrooms. I had watched it walk through the front door of my home for 5 decades. I watched it now on a stranger's body. The boy turned his head, and the afternoon sun caught his profile with the particular cruelty of perfect lighting, the square line of his jaw, the heavy brow, the slight Roman hook of the nose. My father had that nose. Harold had that nose. The Thornton genetic watermark, as identifiable as a brand on cattle. The air left my body without my permission. Harold reached out and gripped the boy's shoulder. It was a small gesture. A hand on a shoulder. I have watched Harold shake hands with senators, embrace foreign oil ministers, clap business partners on the back with the theatrical warmth of a man who knows that physical affirmation is currency. I have never seen his hand on another person's shoulder look like that. Like pride. Like possession. Like something transferred. The boy laughed, a dry, sharp sound that carried across the heat to where I stood perfectly still behind my limestone monument. It was Harold's laugh. Not similar to Harold's laugh. Harold's laugh lived in a different mouth. The sound of it struck me somewhere below the sternum. The boy reached into his jacket and produced a thick manila envelope. Harold took it, turned it over in his hands, nodded once with the satisfied gravity of a man receiving a verdict he expected. The coiling thing in my guts settled into something cold and precise. This was not an affair being managed. Affairs were managed with wire transfers and silence. This was a meeting between a father and the heir he had decided to install. This was a consultation. Harold wasn't paying this boy to disappear, Harold was briefing him. And the manila envelope in my husband's thick, ring-heavy hands almost certainly contained information about the estate. My father's estate. My grandfather's land. For generations of Thornton blood rendered in crude oil and Texas dirt. The gates of my dynasty were being unlatched from the inside, and the man holding the keys was the one I'd trusted with them for 50 years. I walked back to my car with the measured pace of a woman who has not just watched the floor fall out from under her marriage. I sat in the driver's seat and ran the air conditioning on high until the leather stopped burning and the air in my lungs felt like something other than grief. Then I opened my vintage leather planner. The pages fell open to June of this year, then February, then I was flipping backward, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts, pulling at the threads of a timeline I had never had reason to question. San Antonio site visit, 3 days. Houston refinery audit, 4 days. Hill country, land scouting, 3 weeks. 26 years ago. The summer the children were at camp and I was managing the estate redesign and Harold was in the field. 26 years ago, which would make the boy roughly 25. The math did not require a calculator. I pressed my palm flat against the open page of my planner and sat very still while the full weight of it settled onto my shoulders. Every anniversary dinner. Every quietly expensive gift, the emerald earrings, the Cartier bracelet, the restoration of the East Garden, because you mentioned it once, Evelyn, and I listen. Every reassurance that we were building something lasting, something that would outlive us both. Every single one of them now felt like a line item in an account I hadn't been allowed to audit. I was a bookkeeper who had missed a 50-year deficit. I closed the planner. I put the car in drive. I drove home. The Thornton estate rose out of the late afternoon heat like a rebuke. I had always loved the approach, the long, live oak-lined drive, the heavy facade of the house with its pale stone and dark shutters, the way the late light hit the east wing and turned the windows to amber. My father built this house to last 400 years. He built it to be seen. Tonight, looking at it through my windshield, I felt none of the usual settling of my shoulders, none of the territorial comfort of coming home. The oaks looked like sentinels guarding something I no longer recognized. The windows were dark and opaque. I entered through the mudroom to avoid the maid. Consuela had been Harold's hire, and I had learned, over the years, that loyalty in a household runs uphill toward whoever signs the checks, and I went directly to the library without turning on a single light. The wing chair is positioned in the corner furthest from the door, the one with the direct sight line to the driveway. I settled into it, arranged my skirt, and placed my hands in my lap. The scent of floor wax and old leather and the particular paper dust smell of 4 generations of books surrounded me. It had always smelled like safety. Tonight it smelled like a museum. Like preservation for its own sake. Like a room being maintained for visitors who would eventually come to pick through its contents. I smoothed my skirt with both hands. I waited. I watched the headlights sweep across the curtains. The front door groaned at 9:47. I know because I heard the grandfather clock begin its 10-beat sequence 17 minutes later, and I had not moved. Harold walked into the library. He didn't turn on the lights either, which meant he didn't expect me to be in it. He came here to drink, not to explain himself, and the discovery of my silhouette in the corner chair produced a fraction of a second hesitation in his step that he covered almost immediately. Almost. Still up, Evelyn? His voice had that quality he deployed with the children when they were sick, a paternal, slightly exasperated warmth that communicated both care and inconvenience. The club called. Said you left right after me. He moved to the bar and lifted the decanter without waiting for my response, and I let him pour before I registered that he smelled of scotch already. Scotch and the outdoors. Tree shade and grass and something faintly mineral, like creek water. Memorial Park. He launched into the story with the ease of a man who had built the scaffolding long before he needed it. The Permian Basin, a catastrophic leak in one of the older leases, a call from the attorney that demanded immediate attention, nothing to worry about, these things happen, he'd handled it, the paperwork was already filed. The words came in the smooth, overlapping rhythm of a practiced narrative, not recited, never recited. Harold was too good for that, but prepared. Preloaded. He believed I was watching him from a place of wifely concern. He believed he was managing me. I let him finish. I saw a young man in the park today, Harold. The sentence left my mouth at a temperature slightly below ice. I watched him over the face of my Cartier watch, my gaze steady and unblinking. He had your chin. I paused. He even walked like a Thornton. Arrogant. As if he owned the sidewalk. The crystal decanter stopped moving. It didn't fall. Harold's hand is too practiced for that. But it stopped, a microscopic, involuntary arrest in the middle of a pour, and for one long, suspended second, the only sound in the library was the deep, authoritative tick of the grandfather clock measuring out the seconds of something that was ending. I held the silence the way I've held rooms for 50 years. I did not fill it. The decanter came down against the rim of the glass harder than Harold intended. A finger of amber scotch jumped the lip and darkened the mahogany of the bar in a spreading stain he didn't reach for a cloth to address. He didn't turn around. His shoulders were a wall under the pinstripe suit, wide, locked, refusing to give me his face. When he spoke, the booming authority that had commanded boardrooms and county commissioners and the occasional senator was entirely absent. What came out instead was a sound from the bottom of a man's register, defensive and slightly thickened. The park is full of people, Evelyn. You're seeing ghosts. He lifted the glass and drank deeply, and I watched the back of his neck flush red above his collar. In 50 years of marriage, I had watched Harold Thornton walk out of 3 different oil negotiations having taken everything from the table. I had watched him face down a hostile acquisition attempt in 1999 without elevating his heart rate. I had watched him deliver a eulogy for my father, a man he had spent 20 years privately dismissing, with what appeared to be genuine grief, and I had marveled then at his control. I had never, in 50 years, seen Harold's hands shake. The tremor was microscopic. If I had not spent 5 decades learning to read this man the way other women learn to read weather, not the forecast, but the actual sky, I would have missed it entirely. I did not miss it. And with the tremor came a clarity so complete it felt almost physical, like a room flooded with cold light after years of dim, uncertain candles. He was terrified. Not of me, not yet. Of discovery. Of the envelope in the manila folder and whatever it represented arriving in the wrong hands before the plan was ready to execute. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one holding the secret. The sensation was, I will admit, intoxicating. I watched him refill his glass and turned the calculus over with the precision I apply to estate matters. This was not about an old affair. Men of Harold's type had affairs the way other men had fishing weekends, as recreation, as ego maintenance, as an entirely separate and carefully compartmentalized category of existence that had nothing to do with the primary enterprise of their lives. A 25-year-old illegitimate son tucked away in the hill country would not, by itself, threaten the structure we'd built. Harold knew I was not a sentimental woman. He had never confused me for one. No. What I'd witnessed in Memorial Park was something categorically different. Harold was installing an heir. He was routing around me, around our children, and preparing to deliver the Thornton estate to a shadow son who carried the jawline and nothing else. The emergency at the attorney's office was not a leaking oil well. It was the final architecture of a displacement strategy. Move the old co-trustee to the margins, establish the new bloodline as primary, and execute before anyone with standing to contest it had time to mobilize. He thought I was too old to hear him turning the dial. He thought 50 years had softened the bookkeeper. I'm tired, Harold. I rose from the wing chair with the same deliberate grace I use when I intend to end a conversation that has concluded to my satisfaction. I smoothed my skirt once, the pearl necklace catching the thin light from the window, and moved toward the door without hurry. He didn't respond. I didn't require him to. My heels on the marble staircase produced a sound I had always found satisfying, that measured, rhythmic click that announces unhurried purpose, and I climbed without touching the banister, as my mother had taught me, as I had taught myself to do when I needed my spine to feel like architecture rather than biology. Inside the dressing room, I turned the heavy brass bolt. The sound of the lock engaging was not loud. But in the silence of that house, it carried. I stood before the vanity and looked at my reflection with the same forensic attention I would give an estate inventory. The silver bob sat where it had been set Wednesday morning, almost entirely intact despite the afternoon. The ivory skin, the steel blue eyes, the aristocratic jawline that had faced down every challenge since my father put the weight of this dynasty on my shoulders at 34. I had never, in all those years, been afraid of a fight. I was not afraid now. I was organized. The woman in the mirror was not a wife who had just discovered her husband's betrayal. She was a matriarch whose sovereignty was under siege. Distinct problem. Distinct solution. I turned away from the mirror and went to my escritoire. The private phone lives in the escritoire's false bottom, behind the green leather pen tray. Harold purchased this desk for me as a 40th anniversary gift. I've always appreciated the irony that the weapon he never knew about lives inside a gift from him. The number I needed wasn't saved under its actual purpose. It lived between a restaurant in Austin and a retired interior designer, filed under R. My father had used Raymond Coles for everything that couldn't be handled through normal channels, the kind of man who had no office, no website, no business card, but who had been present, silently useful, at every significant inflection point in the Thornton dynasty's history. I'd called him once, at my father's funeral, to confirm that the matter of a contested land deed in Kerr County had been resolved quietly and permanently. He had confirmed it in 11 words and hung up. I dialed. It rang 3 times. "This is Evelyn Thornton." My voice was entirely steady. "I need a full workup on a young man, approximately 25, likely connected to the hill country. And I need it before the banks open on Monday." A brief silence. Then, "Understood, Mrs. Thornton." He hung up. I set the phone down and looked at the silver pill case on the corner of the escritoire, the heart medication, the 8 p.m. dose I'd almost missed. I opened it, dry swallowed both pills, and replaced the lid with a precise click. The grandfather clock downstairs began to strike 10. I counted each note and looked at the locked door of my dressing room and thought about the envelope changing hands in Memorial Park, and about the manila paper that had touched my husband's fingers, and about the boy's laugh that was Harold's laugh, and about the fact that somewhere in this city, an attorney I had eaten dinner with for 30 years was helping to build the legal architecture of my erasure. The game had begun. Harold had moved first, and he had been moving for years, and he had assumed that the silence of a 74-year-old woman was the silence of decline. He was mistaken. I had simply been waiting to see the whole board before I touched a piece. I picked up my vintage leather planner, turned to a fresh page, and began to write. The tablet screen cast its cold blue light across the library at 2 in the morning, and I sat at the reading table in my cashmere robe with the posture of a woman conducting a board meeting. Access denied. I looked at the words for a moment before I typed the password again. 16 characters, alphanumeric, the kind of password a serious person builds and never forgets, a combination of my father's initials, the year the first Thornton well came in, and a sequence only I had ever known. I had entered it 10,000 times in the last decade without a second thought. My fingers found the characters automatically, from muscle memory rather than conscious effort. Invalid credentials. The biometric scanner on the tablet's edge glowed its verification blue, and I pressed my thumb against it the way I had pressed it 1,000 mornings before, accessing dividend reports and trust documents and the financial pulse of everything my family had built over 4 generations. The sensor circled once. Turned red. I set the tablet down on the leather blotter with extreme care. I did not slam it. I did not make a sound. I sat very still and looked at the rejected fingerprint on the glass screen, the evidence of my own existence, refused by a machine that had been told I was no longer authorized. He hadn't changed the passwords. That would have required a conversation, a confrontation, a moment I could have contested. Harold was far too methodical for that. He had simply replaced them, rebuilt the entire access architecture of the Thornton Trust portal around a set of credentials I had never been given. My digital identity had not been stolen. It had been quietly vacated, the way you vacate a room, everything moved, nothing damaged, the lock simply reset for a new occupant. He was scrubbing my fingerprints off the steering wheel of my own fortune. I sat in the dark library surrounded by 4 generations of Thornton history, the leather spines, the portrait of my grandfather above the mantel, the Tiffany lamp my mother brought from Houston, and felt the particular cold of a woman who has just discovered that the foundation she has stood on for 50 years is not stone. It is paper. And someone has been holding a match to it for a very long time. I smoothed my robe over my knees and made a note in my planner. By 9:07 the following morning, I knew the phone was compromised as well. The dividend alerts arrive at 9 o'clock with the reliability of a heartbeat, had arrived that way for 11 years, the rhythmic confirmation that the leases were producing, the accounts were current, the financial anatomy of the estate was alive and functioning. I'd taken them for granted the way you take for granted the beating of your own heart, not with gratitude, but with the quiet assumption that it will simply continue. Nothing. A clean, empty screen. I went into the settings with the methodical patience of a woman who does not panic before she has information. It took me 4 minutes to find what Harold had changed and another 2 to understand the full scope of it. The recovery email for my primary account had been replaced with a Gmail address I had never seen. My bank notification preferences had been toggled off, not deleted, which would have been detectable, but silenced, the digital equivalent of cotton in someone's ears. Every automated alert that would have shown me money moving in or out of our accounts had been quietly, surgically disabled. I sat in the breakfast nook with my tea going cold and understood what I was looking at. Not vandalism. Architecture. Someone had designed this, had thought through each point of access, each data stream, each place I might look for confirmation that the financial world was functioning normally, and had closed them off with the precision of a man who knew every back door because he'd helped build the house. I was flying blind. I was meant to be flying blind. And somewhere in the accounts I could no longer see, money was moving. "Evelyn, darling, you're not dressed for the Hamiltons?" Harold stepped into the breakfast room at 9:40 in his charcoal pinstripe, cufflinks already set, the gold Cartier on his wrist. He carried the expression he used with the children when they disappointed him, a practiced, heavy-hearted concern that he wore the way other men wear cologne, automatically, as part of the presentation. I kept my spoon hovering over my grapefruit. "The Hamiltons aren't until next Tuesday, Harold." He sighed. It was a long, theatrical exhalation, the kind designed to fill a room, to make the air itself feel weighted with regret. The kind that sets a woman's teeth on edge. "We discussed it over dinner, Evelyn. For nearly an hour. You even noted it." He gestured toward my leather planner, lying open on the table beside my teacup. I looked down at the page. The entry was in my handwriting. Or rather, it was in a handwriting so close to mine that I needed a second look, and then a third, to locate the tells. The slight heaviness in the downstroke of the capital H, the loop on the lowercase d that curved 3 degrees differently than my own. I have catalogued my own handwriting the way I catalog everything that belongs to me. I know its precise characteristics. I know how I form each letter. This was a forgery. An extraordinarily good forgery, but a forgery. My stomach dropped not from confusion but from the clear, nauseating recognition of what I was looking at. He hadn't just forged a calendar entry. He had studied my handwriting carefully enough to reproduce it with convincing authenticity, which meant he had been planning this moment, this specific, particular moment of making me question what was written in my own hand, for long enough to practice. "I'm sure I just forgot," I said pleasantly, and set down my spoon, and rose to go get dressed. I heard him exhale behind me. Not the theatrical sigh, this one was quieter. The sound of a man whose gambit has landed. In the hallway, out of his sight line, I pressed 2 fingers against the inside of my wrist and felt my own pulse. Steady. Elevated, but steady. I was not confused. I was cataloging. The silver pill case on my nightstand was empty. I stood looking at the velvet-lined interior and did the arithmetic the way I would audit a discrepancy in the estate accounts, methodically, without panic, but with absolute precision. I had refilled the prescription myself at the CVS on Thursday. I had counted the tablets into the case under the pharmacy's fluorescent lights. There had been 5 blue tablets left for the week's morning doses, which meant 5 tablets should be sitting in the velvet lining, and the lining was empty, and no one had been in my bedroom except the maid and Harold. My heart, as if to underscore the point, produced a brief flutter, the subtle arrhythmia that the beta blocker was prescribed to manage, reminding me with clinical timing of its own necessity. I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed for 30 seconds. This was the most elegant piece of the architecture, I had to admit. Not the forged calendar entries or the disabled bank alerts, those were inconveniences I could work around. This was the one that genuinely frightened me, and he knew it, because Harold had watched me take that medication every morning for 6 years and knew precisely what its absence would produce in my body. A racing heart. Trembling hands. The physical symptomology of an elderly woman in cognitive or cardiac distress. Evidence. He was manufacturing evidence. I went to the en-suite bathroom, found the backup prescription in the false bottom of the medicine cabinet. I keep backups the way my father kept reserves, as a matter of philosophy, and took the morning dose with tap water. Then I sat at my escritoire and added the incident to my notes in a small, precise hand. The clock on the nightstand read 7:42. I had a hospital board meeting in 2 hours. The children's hospital boardroom had the particular atmosphere of rooms where important people performed their importance for one another, the heavy oval table, the matching leather chairs, the plaques on the wall commemorating donations from names I'd known since childhood. I have served on this board for 19 years. I have written checks to this institution that funded 3 separate wings. My name is on a plaque by the main entrance. I stood to present the endowment report with the folder in my hands, and Harold's hand came down on my forearm. The pressure was precise, not painful, but total. The grip of a man who has calculated exactly how much force is required to communicate restraint to an audience of observers while appearing, to that same audience, to be offering support. "Let me take that, Evelyn." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the boardroom was quiet, and sound travels in quiet rooms. "You mentioned feeling a bit foggy this morning. Don't overexert yourself." I did not look at him. I looked at the board, 12 faces in various stages of the same expression, the soft tilt of the head, the lowered eyes, the particular social performance of people witnessing something painful and private in a public setting. I watched Patricia Hendricks, who has known me for 30 years, press her lips together in what she believed was a sympathetic smile. I attempted to pull the folder back. Harold's grip tightened by precisely enough to prevent it without appearing to prevent it. To the room, he was a devoted husband managing a difficult moment with grace. To me, he was a jailer demonstrating the dimensions of my cell. I let him take the folder. I sat down. I arranged my hands in my lap and kept my expression composed and distant, the way I've kept it in every room where underestimating me was a precondition of being present, and I listened to Harold present my endowment report in his booming, authoritative voice, and I memorized the faces of every person in the room who watched it happen without saying a word. The Safeway on Westheimer smelled of refrigerated air and institutional cleaner. I pushed a cart with 3 items in it. The cart was cover, not purpose, and turned down the canned goods aisle at 11:15 on a Wednesday morning. Miller materialized from behind a tower of canned peaches the way men in his profession materialize, without announcement, without apparent movement, simply present when he had not been present a moment before. He was mid-50s, unremarkable in every particular, the kind of face that disappears in a crowd the moment you look away. He did not make eye contact. A manila folder slid into my reusable grocery bag between a can of chicken broth and a box of crackers. "The boy's name is Marcus," he said, in the low, lateral murmur of a man accustomed to speaking without moving his lips. "He's living in a $1.2 million condo in Austin. Deeded to Thornton Alpha Holdings last August." I kept pushing the cart. Thornton Alpha Holdings. I let the name settle through me the way cold water settles through ice. Harold had told me that account had been closed, market conditions, rebalancing the portfolio, I'd get the paperwork, standard procedure. I remembered the conversation because I'd meant to follow up, and then the estate garden redesign had required my attention, and I'd filed it under Harold as handling it with the trusting efficiency of a woman who has spent 50 years dividing labor with a partner she believed was acting in good faith. The condo deeded in August. A $1.2 million property, titled under a company name that bore our family's name as though it had always belonged there. My husband was building a parallel kingdom, a separate dynasty, funded with money diverted from our accounts, for a boy who carried his jawline and was being groomed to receive the inheritance that belonged to our children. Our children. I reached the end of the aisle, turned the cart, and kept walking. I was on the back stairs when I heard the study door. The back stairs are narrower than the main staircase and carpeted in a runner that absorbs sound. I had used them since childhood, long before this was Harold's house as well as mine, and old habits still brought me to them when I wanted to move through the house without announcing myself. I was 3 steps from the bottom landing when the front hallway below came into view through the wrought iron balustrade, and I stopped. Miller, not my Miller, but Arthur Miller, the family attorney, 30 years on our payroll, a man I had sat across from at Thanksgiving dinner more times than I could count, was being shown into Harold's private study by Consuela. He wasn't carrying a briefcase. He was carrying a stack of forms that I recognized by their color and their weight even from the stairs, and a heavy brass notary seal that caught the hallway light as Consuela closed the study door behind him. I stood very still on the third step and listened. The study door was mahogany and solid and installed in 1987 during the East Wing renovation, and I know from 40 years of living with it that it does not seal cleanly at the bottom. There is a 1/4-inch gap where the threshold meets the frame. Sound travels through it with imperfect but sufficient clarity if the room beyond is quiet. The room beyond was not quiet. Harold's voice and Arthur Miller's voice moved together in the low, clipped register of men executing a plan, and the words that reached me through the gap were not many but they were enough. Incompetence. Guardianship. The hearing. And then Harold's voice, quieter but distinct, she won't contest it. She hasn't been herself. I placed my hand on the wrought iron banister and stood on that step for a long time after the voices dropped back below audibility. Arthur Miller had his brass notary seal and his forms, and Harold had 30 years of apparent loyalty to leverage, and together they were preparing the legal paperwork that would transfer my autonomy, my ability to sign my own name to a document with legal standing, to make a medical decision, to refuse a hospitalization, to Harold, by order of a Texas probate court. They were not waiting for me to fail. They were constructing the evidence of failure. There was a meaningful difference. I walked back up the stairs and added it to my notes. Sarah sat on the floral sofa in the east sitting room with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes carrying that particular species of compassion that children deploy when they have been convinced they are acting in a parent's best interest. She was 46 years old. She had her father's broad shoulders and my eyes, and she was looking at me now with those eyes full of something I recognized as genuine love filtered through a lie she didn't know was a lie. Mom. She reached for my hand. Dad told us about the incidents. The missing keys, the confusion about the Hamiltons. Her touch felt like a door closing. There's a lovely place in the hill country, she continued, her voice gentle and careful, the voice I'd heard her use with her own children when delivering news they wouldn't want. A retreat. Very private, very comfortable. Just a few months of observation, to make sure everything is. Who suggested it? I asked. She blinked. Dad and I discussed. Which one of you raised it first? The blink again. Slower this time. Dad mentioned he'd been concerned. For a while. I looked at my daughter's face, the face I had known since the first moment she existed, since before she existed, and I searched it for the woman I'd raised, the one I'd taught to question what she was told, to read a room, to notice what was missing from a story as much as what was present. She was in there. She was simply buried under 30 years of Harold's careful management of the family narrative, and under the entirely sincere love she had for a mother she had been told was disappearing. I squeezed her hand once and released it. You're a good daughter, Sarah, I said. I know you're trying to help. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of the sitting room, and I did not allow myself to feel the full weight of that particular betrayal until I was behind the locked door of my dressing room. Then I sat at my escritoire for 4 minutes and let myself feel it precisely and completely, the way you lance a wound, quickly, so it can close. Then I picked up my planner and began to think about the library renovation. I've decided the library needs a complete archival restoration, I announced at dinner, and I let my voice carry the faint, distracted tremor that I had been cultivating for 4 days with the dedication of a woman who once played Lady Macbeth in a university production and received a standing ovation. Harold looked up from his lamb. The smirk was almost imperceptible, a micro-expression, the involuntary satisfaction of a man watching his opponent busy herself with irrelevancies while he executes the plan. He had the grace not to say anything condescending, which meant he was feeling confident enough not to need to. Of course, darling, he said. Whatever you need. Diane arrived the next morning in a sensible blazer with measuring tape around her neck and a canvas bag of fabric swatches over one shoulder. She was 53, with sharp eyes behind architectural glasses and the specific kind of stillness that belongs to people who have trained themselves to observe everything without appearing to observe anything. Her portable scanner was the size of a hardback novel and had been built into the bottom of a decorative portfolio case that she carried as naturally as a designer carries a portfolio. I showed her the library with a slightly vacant enthusiasm, pointing at drapes and crown molding and asking gentle, wandering questions about color palettes that I didn't care about in the slightest. Harold passed the doorway twice. The second time, he paused to watch us, and I pointed at a corner sconce with the unfocused energy of a woman who had lost the thread of her own thought, and he moved on. While I performed the renovation consultation, Diane worked the shelves. The performance had its own satisfactions, I will admit. The mismatched pearl earrings, one South Sea, one freshwater, deployed on a Monday morning as I drifted into the kitchen with a vague, slightly lost expression and opened the refrigerator and stood looking at its contents as though I had forgotten the category of things that belong inside one. I closed it, opened it again, took out the lemon with the puzzled concentration of a woman encountering a lemon for the first time. Consuela reported it to Harold within the hour. I know because Harold mentioned at lunch, with exquisite casualness, that if I was feeling scattered, I should let him know and he would arrange to have a meal service handle the kitchen. Very solicitous. Very concerned. The keys in the rose bushes were a particular pleasure. I walked out to the garden on a bright Thursday morning, left my keys hanging on a thorned cane at the base of the English roses, and walked back inside. The gardener found them before noon and brought them to Consuela, who brought them to Harold, who brought them to me in the library with an expression of such carefully performed tenderness that I had to look at the middle distance to prevent myself from saying something precise and devastating. "We found your keys, Evelyn," he said, as though this confirmed something. "Oh, thank goodness," I said, and let my hand tremble slightly as I reached for them. He stopped locking his study door on Friday. He stopped lowering his voice on phone calls by the following Tuesday. He was relaxing into victory. The problem was solving itself. Diane found me in the basement archives on a Thursday afternoon, 9 days after she'd arrived. The basement smells of archival boxes and old climate control and the particular mustiness of paper that has absorbed decades of Texas humidity. She was standing under the fluorescent light with the color gone slightly out of her face, her scanner on the table beside a stack of ledgers, a laptop open in front of her. She didn't show me fabric swatches. She turned the laptop screen to face me. The spreadsheet was precise and methodical and comprehensive in the way that only a forensic accountant can make a document that is essentially a record of theft feel like a piece of evidence rather than a crime scene. Column by column, the date, the account, the transfer amount, the destination. A shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under a name designed to sound administrative rather than personal. 12 years of wire transfers, small enough in any individual instance to avoid automated flagging, large enough in aggregate to constitute a systematic and deliberate hollowing out of the Thornton estate accounts. $15 million. And every transfer was authorized with a signature that looked exactly like mine. "He's been doing it for 12 years, Diane said. Her voice was professionally steady. The signature on every authorization matches your handwriting profile at approximately 94% accuracy. A skilled forgery, not identical, but close enough that it would pass a standard review. You'd need a forensic document examiner to contest it. $15 million. 12 years. My signature, reproduced on authorization after authorization by a man who had spent 5 decades in close enough proximity to my handwriting to learn it the way other men learn a language, by immersion, by repetition, by practice. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Not from fear. I sat with the sensation for a moment and identified it with precision, not fear. Something harder than fear. The cold, settled weight of evidence in hand. Of being, for the first time since Memorial Park, on solid ground. "I'll need copies of everything," I said. "Originals stay in the archives." "Already done," Diane said. I looked at the spreadsheet for another moment, at the column of dates beginning 12 years ago. The same year Harold had told me the Hill Country account needed restructuring, the same year he'd recommended Arthur Miller take over the trust administration, and I thought about Marcus and his $1.2 million Austin condo, and about the manila envelope changing hands in Memorial Park, and about what it meant that Harold had been building this for 12 years with my forged signature as his foundation. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had built his entire alternative future on a structural lie about my identity. He had used my name, my authority, my signature, all the apparatus of who I was in the legal and financial world, to fund the replacement of everything I was in our actual one. I smoothed my skirt. I closed the laptop. He came into my dressing room at 4 in the afternoon without knocking. I was seated at the vanity applying face cream, which is what I had been doing at 4 in the afternoon since before Harold and I were married, and he knew this, and he came in without knocking anyway because the gesture communicated something he wanted me to understand, that the architecture of ordinary privacy and courtesy that structures a household no longer applied to me. That I was no longer, in the operative sense, the mistress of this room. He had a legal packet in his hand. It was thick, the pages crisp and white and freshly printed, held together with the heavy metal clip that Arthur Miller uses on all his documents. I know his formatting. I have signed his documents for 30 years. Harold looked at me with the expression he had perfected over weeks of practice, that sickening compound of triumph and feigned sorrow, of a man who has told himself that what he's doing is necessary and has almost managed to believe it. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said, in the voice he would use with the board of directors, "but for your own safety, I've filed for emergency guardianship." He set the packet on the vanity. Next to my empty pill case, he'd left it there deliberately, I understood, as a visual reminder of the evidence. The hearing is tomorrow. Until then, I've arranged for a nurse to stay in the guest room. For your protection. He left without waiting for my response, which was also a message. I sat at the vanity and looked at the legal packet and at the empty pill case and at my own face in the mirror. Behind me, through the window, the estate's green lawn stretched out toward the live oaks in the long golden light of a Texas afternoon. The jasmine on the porch was in bloom. The estate smelled exactly as it had always smelled. I was a prisoner in it. I reached for my private phone. The sedative tea smelled of chamomile and something underneath that didn't belong there, a faint, chemical sweetness that sat at the back of the nose like a warning. The nurse Harold had installed in the guest room had brought it to me at 10 o'clock with the professional warmth of a woman paid to perform warmth, setting it on the nightstand beside a small plate of shortbread as though we were at a bed and breakfast rather than engaged in a conflict she had no idea she'd entered. I thanked her pleasantly, waited for the sound of her footsteps retreating down the hall, and carried the cup to the parlor palm in the corner of my dressing room. The palm had survived worse. At 2 in the morning, the house held its breath. The estate at this hour is a particular kind of silent, not the silence of absence but the silence of weight, all that stone and oak and polished marble pressing down into the dark with the authority of generations. I know this silence the way I know my own heartbeat. I was born into it, and I have moved through it for 74 years with the sure knowledge of which floorboards speak and which staircases cooperate. The servants' stairs cooperate. I went down in bare feet, my cashmere robe pulled close, one hand trailing the cold plaster wall. The linoleum of the basement hallway was cold through my soles, and the air smelled of furnace dust and the archival mustiness I associated, now, with Diane's work rather than with family history. A thin line of light bled under the furnace room door. She was waiting in the shadows past the boiler, her laptop open on a folding table she'd brought down herself. It screened the single predatory eye of a woman who had not slept. I pulled the door closed behind me and stood beside her in the dark, and for a moment we were simply two women in a basement in the middle of the night, which is either the beginning of a catastrophe or the beginning of a reckoning, depending entirely on which side of the plan you occupy. "I found the bypass," Diane said, her voice pulled tight with the particular adrenaline of someone who has been following a thread for days and has just found where it leads. He ran the transfers through 3 intermediary accounts before they reached the Caymans. Standard obfuscation. But the origin point is always the same trust account, the one that carries your name as primary authorizing officer. The furnace clicked and settled. Outside, somewhere in the dark Texas night, a mockingbird was performing its inventory of stolen songs. "Show me everything," I said. She clicked through the folder and I stood in the amber light of the laptop screen and looked at what my husband had built with 12 years of patience and my forged signature. The Montana property deeds were extraordinary in their audacity. 10,000 acres in Big Sky, photographed from a county assessor's drone, an expanse of high grassland and timber and the kind of sky that Texans speak of with competitive reverence, priced at $12 million. Purchased 3 years ago through a limited liability company registered in Delaware, whose registered agent was listed as Marcus A. Reyes of Austin, Texas. 3 years ago, Harold had sat across from me at the dining room table and shown me the quarterly trust statement with its column of red figures and explained, with the measured regret of a responsible fiduciary, that the personal trust had sustained a $12 million market loss. I remembered the conversation because I'd asked to review the underlying position reports and he'd handed me a summary document rather than the raw data, and I had accepted the summary because it was Harold and we had been managing this estate together for 50 years and I had trusted the division of labor. I looked at the Montana grassland on Diane's screen and understood that Harold had not merely been stealing money. He had been converting it, liquidating my liquid assets and physicalizing them into solid earth, turning my inheritance into land that could be titled, deeded, and handed to a young man who didn't know how to wear a suit but who carried, Harold believed, the Thornton jawline and therefore the Thornton right. He was building a kingdom on my grave. He had simply made the tactical error of building it while I was still in it. "How much in total?" I asked. "Confirmed and documented?" $15 million in wire transfers, $12 million in the Montana acquisition. $27 million, Evelyn. Over 12 years. I stood in the furnace room for a moment with that number settling through me. "I'll need everything on an external drive," I said. "And I need you out of this house before 6 a.m. Diane's sharp eyes found mine over the laptop screen. "You're moving tonight." "I'm moving now," I said. "Tomorrow is already in motion." The morning mist was low over the estate drive when I took the Continental out through the main gates at 6:45, and the gates swung open with the automatic deference they had shown me for 30 years. Whatever Harold had done to my digital existence, he had not thought to revoke my access to my own driveway. That oversight pleased me in a specific and functional way. Miller's law office is on Post Oak Boulevard in a building that smells of recirculated air and billing hours. I know the building because I've signed documents in it for 3 decades, sat across from Arthur Miller in his leather chair and trusted him with the legal anatomy of my family's fortune because my father trusted him and because Harold trusted him and because 30 years of shared dinners and holiday cards and the accumulated social weight of long professional relationships had suggested that trust was warranted. His secretary wasn't in yet. He was. I found him in his private office with his morning coffee and his reading glasses and the practiced comfort of a man who considers himself safe in his own sanctuary, and I set the Montana deeds and Diane's full audit summary on his mahogany desk with a sound that was not quite a slam but contained all the force of one. "Explain this, Miller." My voice was the temperature I reserve for moments that require precision rather than volume. The refined ice, Harold had always called it, though he hadn't meant it as a compliment. "Explain why my personal trust is currently grazing cattle in Montana under a stranger's name." He didn't blink. That was the first sign, not the absence of alarm, which a practiced man can suppress, but the specific quality of his stillness, the stillness of a man who has already wargamed this conversation and knows which moves he has in reserve. He set his coffee down. He reached into his side drawer, unhurried, deliberate, the motion of a man performing confidence for an audience, and produced a blue litigation folder, which he slid across the desk toward me with a speed calibrated to land between efficient and contemptuous. Inside were documents I recognized by their format and their weight before I read a word of their content. Wire transfer authorizations. Deed releases. Trust amendments. A dozen pages, precisely formatted, bearing the Thornton Estate Standard Document header. And at the bottom of each page, my signature. I looked at the documents the way I would look at any piece of evidence, systematically, without reaction, beginning at the top and reading with the full attention I'd given every document I'd signed in 40 years of estate management. The signature at the bottom of each page was the elegant, looped capital E I had used since my mother corrected my penmanship at age 9, and the sharp, decisive T that my father had said looked like authority. Each signature was consistent. Each one matched the others. Each one matched mine with a fidelity that produced a cold, particular nausea. Not because I was confused about whether I had signed them. Because I hadn't, and they were perfect anyway. "You authorized these," Evelyn, Miller said. His voice had the quality of mock sympathy, the tone of a man who has practiced delivering a verdict and has decided that a slight overlay of regret makes it more convincing. "At least, that's what the record will show when the guardianship hearing begins this afternoon." He picked up his coffee and took a sip and looked at me over the rim with the steady ease of a man who believes he is holding every card in the deck. I looked at Arthur Miller across the mahogany desk of his office, and I looked at the documents bearing my forged name, and I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives when something you have suspected fully reveals itself, the complete shape of what he had built. He wasn't Harold's lawyer. He was Harold's architect. The forgeries were not Harold's work. Harold's hands were steady in a boardroom, but his patience was not the kind required to study a woman's handwriting over years and reproduce it with 94% accuracy. That was Miller's work. Page by page, authorization by authorization, over a decade of careful, methodical construction. He had not merely assisted in my erasure, he had drafted it. He had written me out of my own legal existence with the same pen he'd used to bill me for 30 years of trustworthy service. I thought of all the documents I had signed in this office. All the estate instruments and trust amendments and account authorizations that I had reviewed and trusted because they came through Arthur Miller, because they were formatted correctly, because they bore the language of legitimacy. Every one of those signings had been an opportunity. Every one of those visits had been a lesson in my signature. He had been studying me in my own legal home. "I'll see you this afternoon," I said, and I took the blue litigation folder because he did not stop me, and I walked out of his office into the post-oak morning with the folder under my arm and the full weight of my legal erasure pressing against my ribs like a structural failure. My investigator was leaning against the Continental in the parking lot. This was not a coincidence. Miller had arranged, with this meeting, to demonstrate his complete control over the situation, and my investigator's presence in the parking lot, the one person in my operation whose existence Miller should not have known about, made my scalp go cold in a way that took me a moment to interpret correctly. Then I looked at him more carefully. His posture was not the posture of a man who had been placed there to surveil me. His posture was the posture of a man waiting to deliver something he considered urgent. He didn't say a word. He held out a sealed white envelope. "Results from the coffee cup," he said. "And a hair sample from Harold's comb for the baseline. Just came through." I took the envelope. The parking lot smelled of exhaust and cut grass and the first hint of the afternoon heat building under the morning haze. The Texas sun was bright and specific, the kind that finds everything. My fingers found the seal. The technical language of a DNA paternity report is precise and mercifully brief at the summary level. I have read enough legal and scientific documents in my life to move past the procedural language to the operative findings, and I did that now, standing beside my car in a post-oak parking lot with the envelope still in my hand. I scanned the loci. I found the summary. Probability of paternity, 0%. The world did not spin. It went still in the particular way that things go still when the architecture of your understanding shifts beneath you, not dramatically, but completely, the way a building settles when a load-bearing element fails. The edges of my vision went gray for one moment, and my hand found the roof of the Continental, and I stood with the weight of the car under my palm. Marcus was not Harold's son. The jawline in Memorial Park. The arrogant stride. The dry, sharp laugh that had struck me as genetic evidence. I had been so certain, the certainty of a woman who has spent 50 years learning a man's physical vocabulary, who knows his body the way a scholar knows a text, who trusts her own trained observation as the most reliable instrument in her arsenal. I had been wrong. Or rather, I had been led. I had looked at a young man in a park and seen exactly what I was meant to see. The jawline that resembled Harold's. The stride cultivated to match. The meeting staged in a public park where I could follow Harold and find it. I turned this over and felt the shape of it. The encounter in Memorial Park had not been an accident I'd stumbled onto. It had been a presentation. I sat in the driver's seat and held the report and thought. Elena. The name arrived not as a deduction but as a memory, the specific, clear memory of a woman I had not thought about in 25 years. Elena Reyes, who had worked in the Thornton household for 3 years in the late 90s, who had been observant and resentful in equal measure, who had watched the family with the sharp, cataloging eyes of someone keeping score. She'd left under circumstances that Harold had handled and that I had not inquired into, because in those years I was managing the estate redesign and my father's declining health and 3 children's worth of school calendars, and Harold handled the household staff. Harold had handled Elena. And Elena, with the patience and intelligence of a woman who understood exactly how much she had to work with, had spent 25 years building her countermove. She had found a boy, Marcus Reyes, the last name was not a coincidence, it was a signature, who resembled Harold closely enough to pass the scrutiny of a suspicious wife at distance in a park. She had cultivated the resemblance, the jawline she could not manufacture but had selected for, the stride she could teach, the arrogant bearing that was not nature but performance. She had sold Harold the one thing that Harold's vanity made him desperately, completely vulnerable to, a biological legacy. A second chance at dynasty from a body he'd discarded. Harold was not the architect of my destruction. Harold was the mark. He had looted $27 million from his own family's future and murdered his own marriage and prepared to exile his wife to a sanitarium in the hill country, not out of calculated malice but out of the oldest and most catastrophic species of male vanity. He had wanted to leave something of himself in the world outside the Thornton name, and Elena had shown him the door, and he had walked through it without looking at the floor. He had built his entire insurgency on a foundation of someone else's long con. I sat with this for a long moment, the DNA report in my lap, the Texas morning going gold around me. Then I drove home. The formal invitations were on the hall table when I returned, arranged with the deliberate elegance of a trap being dressed as hospitality. Heavy cream cardstock, the Thornton family monogram embossed at the top, the copperplate script precise and traditional. Family Unity Dinner, 7 p.m. I stood in the entry hall and looked at the invitations and at the new maid, Harold's hire, a young woman who did not meet my eyes, setting the silver candlesticks on the mahogany dining table through the open archway. The good candlesticks, the Georgian pair that had been in my mother's family before they were in mine. The table was being laid with the ceremony of a state occasion. This was Harold's stage. I understood its function immediately and completely. The children gathered, the formal setting, the atmosphere of gravity and family solemnity, all of it constructing the context in which a beloved patriarch would, with visible reluctance and great love, present the evidence of his wife's deterioration to the people most likely to believe it and least likely to contest it. And when I reacted, when I brought out the audit, the DNA, the forgeries, I would be doing precisely what a woman in the grip of paranoid delusion does when confronted with the care of her family. I would be producing documents. I would be making accusations. I would be performing, for the assembled witnesses, exactly the instability they had been prepared to expect. Harold had not set this dinner as a trap. He had set it as a closing argument. I carried my invitation upstairs, set it on the escritoire, and opened my planner. At 7:05, my children came into the dining room. Sarah didn't look at me when she took her seat, her eyes finding the middle distance with the determined vagueness of a woman who has decided what she believes and has no interest in complications. Thomas sat across from her, adjusting his tie with the repeated, mechanical motion of a man whose hands need to be occupied while his face performs steadiness. They were dressed in the dark colors of people who have already decided what kind of occasion this is. Harold sat at the head of the table. I have watched Harold Thornton occupy the head of that table for 50 years, and I know every register of his presence in that chair, the expansive ease of a man entertaining, the clipped authority of a business discussion, the theatrical warmth he deploys when performing family for an audience. Tonight he occupied it with the vitality that had been absent for weeks, the particular glow of a man who has arrived at the end of a long project and can see the finish line from where he's sitting. He poured the wine with a steady hand. He looked at me across the length of the mahogany table, and his smile said what his mouth did not say. I've won. I looked at my children's lowered faces and at the candles burning in my mother's Georgian silver and at the man at the head of my father's table, and I felt, for one clear, honest moment, the full weight of what 50 years had cost me. Not a flash of weakness, simply an accounting. What I had given to this household and this man and this dynasty, and what the return on that investment had turned out to be. I smoothed my napkin across my lap and picked up my wine glass and waited. The briefcase clasp is a sound I will not forget. Miller stepped into the dining room before the soup was served, and his briefcase opened with a click of such precision that it cut through the candlelit silence like a blade. He crossed to the table unhurried, the way men move when they believe the outcome is already determined, and he set the papers in front of my plate with the care of a man placing something fragile. The voluntary commitment papers. Evelyn. His voice was the smooth, professional purr of a man who has practiced this sentence. We all want what's best for you. If you sign these now, we can avoid the public hearing. We can keep the Thornton name out of the papers. He folded his hands, the brass cufflinks catching the candlelight. It's for your dignity. I looked at the papers. The empty signature lines at the bottom were the particular white of fresh document paper, waiting. I looked at the pen in my hand, my father's gold Mont Blanc, the one he'd given me on my 40th birthday with the instruction that a woman of her word should sign her name with something that lasts. I had signed every significant document of my adult life with this pen. The estate instruments, the trust agreements, the charitable endowments, the letters to my children's schools. I had also, apparently, signed $15 million out of my own future with it, or rather, Arthur Miller had signed my future out of existence using its likeness. I looked around the table. Harold, leaning back in his chair with the smirk of a man watching the last play of a game he'd already won. Sarah, staring at her plate with the careful attention of a woman who has told herself she isn't watching. Thomas, whose tie had finally been adjusted to his satisfaction and who now had nothing left to do with his hands. Miller, standing at my elbow with his briefcase and his brass cufflinks and 30 years of carefully accumulated betrayal. And on the table, invisible to everyone else in the room, the weight of everything I had gathered in the weeks since Memorial Park, Diane's audit with its $27 million of documented theft. The recording I had made in Miller's office that morning, the small digital device in the outer pocket of my bag having captured every word of his "You authorized these, Evelyn," at least that's what the record will show. The DNA report in the blue folder beside my chair. The private phone in my bag with Raymond Coles on the last dialed number. Harold looked at me across the candlelight with a smile that said I was cornered, penniless on paper, and perceived as a lunatic by my own children. He was right about 2 of those 3. I set my father's pen down on the tablecloth. I looked at Harold, not at his smile, but at the man behind it, the man who had gambled the future of our children and the legacy of my ancestors on a lie that a resentful maid had built 25 years ago to punish him for discarding her, and I felt, replacing the grief and the fury and the cold strategic calculation of the past weeks, something simpler and more final. He had bet everything on a phantom. And I was holding the proof. I reached for the blue folder beside my chair. The gold Mont Blanc touched the tablecloth with a sound like a gavel. Not a slam, I don't slam things. But the sharp, precise clack of my father's pen set down with deliberate finality cut through the dining room's candlelit silence with enough force that Thomas flinched visibly, his hand jerking against his wine glass. I noted this without satisfaction and without apology. I had set the pen down where it belonged, beside the papers I would not be signing. I won't be signing, Miller. The register of my voice surprised even me, not because it was loud, but because it was the opposite of loud in a way that fills a room more completely than volume ever does. It dropped an octave into a frequency I associate with my father when he was ending a negotiation rather than continuing one. The refined ice Harold had always found useful to reference when describing me to people I was about to outmaneuver. I looked at Harold directly. Not at his expression, I was watching his eyes, specifically the light in his pupils, that particular triumphant gleam he carried when he believed a room was fully in his control. I watched it flicker. A shadow of something moved through it, not doubt yet, but the precursor of doubt, the moment before a man who has planned extensively begins to sense that one variable has been miscalculated. I did not look like a woman losing her mind. I looked like a judge who had already read the verdict. Miller cleared his throat, a brief, professional sound designed to re-establish the architecture of the moment. Evelyn, I understand this is difficult. I'm sure you do, I said, and did not look at him, and kept my eyes on Harold. Harold's face moved through its transformations the way weather moves through an afternoon sky, quickly, and with the particular drama of a system that has been building pressure for a long time. The devoted husband expression, that careful, patronizing blend of concern and regret, dissolved from the surface of his face and left behind what had always been underneath it, the hard, angular hunger of a man who has never in his life been told no by someone with the standing to make it stick. He snapped his fingers at Consuela. The gesture was so reflexive, so thoroughly Harold, the snap, the dismissive tilt of the chin, the assumption that the room would reorganize itself around his intention, that for one disorienting moment I saw the entire 50 years of our marriage compressed into a single frame. Every room he'd entered with that posture. Every person who'd adjusted their behavior in response to it. Including me, more times than I could count, before I had learned that the snap was not authority but performance, and performance could be waited out. Fine, he said. If you won't accept reality, you'll confront it. The double doors opened. Marcus stepped in wearing an expensive suit, navy, well cut, the kind purchased by someone who has recently been given access to money and hasn't yet developed the taste that earns it. He stood in the doorway with that particular bearing I'd watched in Memorial Park, shoulders back, chin up, the arrogant, wide-planted stance of a man who had been coached in how a Thornton enters a room. He carried it well. I gave him that. Harold gestured to the empty chair beside Sarah with the proprietary satisfaction of a man presenting a gift he's been hiding for months. This is my son, Evelyn. The word son landed in the room with all the weight Harold intended it to carry. The air you've been trying to erase from your failing memory. Tell the children again how he doesn't exist. Marcus moved toward the chair. He didn't look at me. He looked at Harold with the careful attentiveness of a young man who has been told to follow a script and is monitoring the director. Sarah's hands were very still on the tablecloth. Harold turned to our children with the specific energy of a man who has reached the climactic scene of a performance he's been rehearsing and is determined to land it. See? He spread his hands, the theatrical gesture of a man inviting observation, as though the room were a courtroom and the assembled family were his jury. She's been stalking this boy. She's been hallucinating conspiracies because she can't handle the truth of my past. He leaned over the table, his weight coming forward onto his knuckles, and brought his face to within a foot of mine. He smelled of expensive scotch and the outdoors and underneath both, something I hadn't smelled from Harold in 50 years, desperation. The faintly acrid, biological truth of a man whose plan is further from solid ground than he's admitting to himself. Your mother is a danger to this family's reputation, kids. His voice had that oily, practiced pity that he'd been deploying for weeks, the tone designed to make concern sound like grief, manipulation sound like love. She's obsessed with thefts that don't exist and a son she thinks is a ghost. It's a tragedy, really. He drew back and shook his head with the slow, heavy resignation of a man burdened by another person's illness. I've tried to protect her. I've tried to shield you from how bad it's gotten. He was waiting for me to react. He needed me to react, a raised voice, tears, the flat palms slapping the table, anything he could isolate as evidence, anything his witnesses could carry out of this room and report to a judge as the behavior of an unstable woman. I looked at him for a moment, at the ruddy face and the military haircut and the heavy gold cufflinks and the 50 years of practice performance, and I thought of what Elena Reyes had known about Harold that I had taken 50 years to learn, that he was, at the foundation of all his architecture, a man who needed to be believed. Who required, above all things, an audience that would confirm the story he was telling about himself. I reached into the hidden pocket of my jacket. The forensic summary was bound in professional blue cardstock, Diane's touch, the small formality of presentation that turns a document from a collection of numbers into an argument. I set one copy on the tablecloth in front of Sarah with the care of a woman placing something important, and another in front of Thomas, and I smoothed both with the flat of my hand. "This isn't paranoia, children," I said. "It's an audit." I watched their eyes move to the pages with the hesitant attention of people who have been told what they'll find before they look and are discovering that what's actually there is something else entirely. Sarah's face went through 3 distinct phases in the space of 10 seconds, resistance, recognition, and a dawning expression I associated with the particular horror of being wrong about something that matters. Thomas stopped adjusting his tie. $15 million of your inheritance has been funneled into a shell company called Thornton Alpha Holdings over the last 12 years. I kept my voice even, factual, the voice of a woman reading from documentation rather than making accusations. Your father didn't find a son. He found a way to rob you while I was distracted by his gaslighting. I gestured toward the Montana property deed at the bottom of the page. There's also a $12 million ranch in Big Sky, Montana, titled in Marcus's name through the same shell company, purchased with what Harold reported to me as a trust market loss 3 years ago. Miller's hand moved toward Sarah's copy. I tapped my phone on the table. The recording quality was good. I had held the device still in the outer pocket of my bag throughout the morning's confrontation, and Miller's office had the natural acoustics of a room built for the clear transmission of important words. His voice came through the dining room's candlelit air with the textural precision of something recorded close and carefully. You authorized these, Evelyn. A pause. The ambient sound of a mahogany office in the early morning. At least, that's what the record will show when the guardianship hearing begins this afternoon. And then the additional admission I had waited for, the slight elaboration that comes when a confident man relaxes into the assumption that the room contains only people who already know what he knows, regarding the signatures, the forgeries, the decade of carefully constructed false authorizations. I watched Miller's face complete its journey from smug to gray. Not gradually, quickly, the way color drains from something when the blood is suddenly required elsewhere. His briefcase handle was in his hand before the recording finished. I may be 74, Miller, I said, and I let the tiniest trace of something dry and precise enter my voice, the ghost of the humor my father had deployed in rooms like this one. But I've always known how to use a wire. It's a habit I picked up from him. I checked my Cartier watch. The State Bar takes a dim view of forgeries and elder abuse, I said. My gaze on Miller was steady and unblinking. And the district attorney is specifically interested in multi-million-dollar fraud schemes with documented paper trails. I set the watch face down on the tablecloth, a gesture, not a necessity. I knew the time precisely. I'll give you 3 minutes to leave this house. 10 minutes to reach your office and begin your resignation. If you're still in this county by midnight, the recording goes to the DA's office and the State Bar simultaneously. The forensic documentation goes with it. Miller did not look at Harold. That was the detail I noted, the absence of a final appeal to the man who had been his patron and his partner. There was no glance across the table for guidance, no silent communication between co-conspirators reassessing their position. Harold, for the first time perhaps in their long collaboration, was simply not relevant to Miller's immediate problem. Miller picked up his briefcase, and the sound of his footsteps crossing the dining room floor and through the entry hall and out the front door came back to us in the high-ceilinged room with the clarity of a percussion piece, fast, uneven, increasingly distant. The front door opened and closed. Sarah let out a breath she'd been holding. Harold remained at the head of the table, and his hands, I noticed, were very still. He moved fast for a man of 75, I'll grant him that. He lunged across the table with the sudden, violent physicality of a man who has run out of strategies and is defaulting to the body's oldest option, his hand curling into a fist aimed at Diane's audit summary. I didn't flinch. I pulled the white DNA envelope from the inner pocket of my jacket and slapped it onto the table with my palm flat against it, pinning it to the lace before his hand could reach anything. He stopped. I looked at him across the tablecloth, across the candles and the good china and the crystal wine glasses and the lace my mother had bought in Brussels in 1962, and I looked at him the way I'd looked at the parlor palm before I poured the sedative tea into its soil, with perfect, clinical calm. You gambled everything on a bloodline, Harold. I kept my voice level and clean. You bet the Thornton legacy on a reflection in a mirror. I slid the envelope toward Marcus, who had not moved from his chair since sitting down and who was now wearing the expression of a young man who has arrived at a dinner party and is only now realizing it is not the dinner party he was told about. But the thing about mirrors is, they don't have any depth. I met Marcus's eyes directly for the first time since he'd walked through the door, and I said it without particular cruelty, because he was not, I had concluded, the primary villain of this story, he was its instrument. They're just silver and glass. Marcus looked at the envelope. Then at Harold. Then at the envelope again. Harold's hand was still on the tablecloth. Probability of paternity, I said, and the words moved through the vaulted ceiling of the dining room with the acoustic weight of the space, 0%. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with the specific gravity of a fact landing in a room full of people who have organized their assumptions around its opposite. I looked at Marcus. Elena didn't give you a son, Harold. She gave you a puppet. I kept my voice factual, dispassionate, the voice of a woman reading from a report because she is reading from a report. This boy is no more a Thornton than the man who tends the roses. I looked at Marcus directly. You were chosen because you resembled him closely enough to pass a surveillance distance observation by a suspicious wife. The jawline, the walk, the manner, all of it coached or selected for. Elena Reyes understood Harold better than Harold understood himself, which, I'll admit, is not an especially high bar. Marcus's face had gone through several rapid changes and arrived at something I recognized as the expression of a young man doing rapid financial calculations. The condo. The car. The expenses Harold had been covering. The entire material infrastructure of his existence over the past several years, all of it predicated on a paternity claim that had just been reduced to a number. 0. He stood. He straightened his expensive jacket with a gesture that managed to be simultaneously composed and terrified, and he walked to the dining room doors, and he left, and no one said anything to stop him. Harold stared at the DNA report. I have watched Harold Thornton occupy rooms for 50 years with the particular assurance of a man who has never, not once, walked into a space without the reasonable expectation that it would reorganize itself around his presence. I have watched him in boardrooms and courtrooms and charity functions and the private geography of our own home, and in all of that time I have never seen him small. He was small now. The paper crinkled under his trembling fingers, the big, ring-heavy hands that had gripped decanter and pen and table edge and the shoulder of a boy who wasn't his, and his breath came in the ragged, wet intervals of a man whose body is processing something his mind hasn't finished refusing yet. He looked up from the report and his eyes went to the empty chair where Marcus had been sitting, and then to the DNA results, and I watched him search for the jawline he'd convinced himself was his legacy reflected in a stranger's face and find, instead, the full and irreversible comprehension of what he had done. He had looted the accounts. He had forged my name. He had hidden my medication and rewritten my calendar and staged the deterioration of my mind for witnesses who loved me. He had turned our children into instruments of my incarceration. He had done all of it, $27 million of it, 50 years of it, for a boy who had been cast in a role by a woman who had understood, 25 years ago, that the most efficient way to destroy Harold Thornton was to offer him exactly what he wanted most. He was a man who had burned his house down to stay warm, and now he was sitting in the ashes. The Georgian candlesticks flickered in the draft from the open doors. The shift in the room was something I felt before I saw, a change in the atmospheric pressure of the space, the way weather changes before the wind arrives. Sarah stood up. She didn't look at Harold. She walked to my side of the table with the deliberate, measured steps of a woman who has made a decision she will not be reversing, and she placed her hand on my shoulder. The weight of it was firm and present, the hand of a woman rather than the apologetic touch of a daughter who has been told her mother is failing. Thomas pushed his chair back with a screech of mahogany on the hardwood that broke the silence like a stone through glass. He was on his feet, and his face, my son's face, the face I'd watched move through every expression available to a human being over the course of 46 years, was carrying something I had not seen on it since he was 12 years old and had discovered his first serious injustice. Pure, unfiltered, trembling rage. "You were going to commit, Mom." His voice was barely above a whisper, which made it louder than shouting. He stared at Harold across the length of the table with the focused intensity of a man who is choosing, with some effort, to remain in his chair. "You were going to lock her away for this?" Harold opened his mouth. Thomas shook his head once, a single, definitive motion, and Harold closed it again. Sarah's hand tightened on my shoulder. I covered it with my own for a moment, a small gesture, brief, not sentimental but real, and then I reached into my jacket for the final 2 documents. I placed them on the table side by side with the precision of a woman who has handled estate documents for 40 years and knows that the way a paper lands carries its own argument. 2 choices, Harold. I tapped the first document. Choice 1, you sign a full confession of fraud. The forensic audit, the forged authorizations, the offshore transfers, the Montana acquisition, all of it documented, all of it signed in your hand. That goes to the DA's office and the federal authorities, given the interstate nature of the shell companies. You'll spend your 80s in a federal facility. I let that land. I watched him look at the paper. The evidence is sufficient for conviction without your signature. The confession simply removes the question of a lengthy trial and the attendant publicity. I moved my hand to the second document. Choice 2, you sign this tonight. A full renunciation of all interest in the Thornton family trust and estate. A complete waiver of any claim to the family name for legal and business purposes. An uncontested divorce, executed without negotiation. I paused. In exchange, you leave this house tonight with 1 suitcase, and you never contact me or our children again by any means, through any intermediary, for any reason. I met his eyes. The Montana ranch is already titled in the shell company's name. Consider it yours. You bought it with my money, you may as well retire to it. Or not. I don't particularly care what you do with the remainder of your time. Harold looked at the documents. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Sarah's hand on my shoulder. He looked at me. For one moment, just one, the length of a breath, I saw something move through his face that wasn't performance. An expression I couldn't fully name, located somewhere in the geography between grief and shame, the expression of a man who has understood something too late to do anything useful with the understanding. Then it was gone, and he reached for the pen. His hand shook so badly that the signature was barely legible. But the notary's seal I had arranged to be present, Raymond Coles's associate, who had been waiting in the study since 6 o'clock that evening, pressed its stamp onto the document with the finality of a door being locked from the outside. I collected both copies. I handed one to Thomas, who took it with both hands and held it as though it were something that might otherwise escape. Harold stood, very slowly, and left the dining room without speaking. I heard his footsteps on the marble staircase, slow, heavy, the measured tread of a man who has forgotten how to move with authority. I heard him in the hallway above. I heard the sound of a suitcase being pulled from a closet. The estate was quiet by 10 o'clock. Marcus was gone. Miller was driving toward whatever version of his future he was assembling from the wreckage of the evening. Harold's car had pulled out of the driveway at 9:47. I noted the time with the automatic precision of a woman who has spent 50 years observing the comings and goings of that driveway, and the gates had swung closed behind him and not opened again. Thomas had stayed to help me go through the immediate practical matters, the calls to Raymond Coles's office, the preliminary conversation with the estate's new attorney, the arrangements for Diane's documentation to be formally transferred to the appropriate authorities. He'd moved through these tasks with the focused, quiet efficiency of a man channeling his anger into something useful, which is the thing I had always loved most about my son. He is, at the core of it, a Thornton. Sarah had made tea, real tea, without additives, brewed in the kitchen with the same muscle memory she'd had since she was 15, and brought it to me on the veranda before she left. She'd held my hand for a moment at the door, and I'd let her, and neither of us had said much, because some things have been said adequately by events and don't require words on top. I was alone on the veranda by 10:15. The jasmine was in full bloom along the porch railing, and the Texas night smelled of it, that heavy, sweet, slightly narcotic perfume that I associate with every significant moment I have spent on this veranda since I was a child running through these rooms behind my father's heels. The dust of the estate's dry grass carried underneath it, and the distant cedar of the hill country on the night air, and the particular coolness that descends on a Texas evening after the sun releases its grip. Behind me, through the open hall door, the wall where Harold's portrait had hung for 23 years showed a clean, pale rectangle on the oak paneling. The portrait itself was in the garden storage shed, face in, which was where I'd had Thomas put it before he left. I had not yet decided what to do with it and did not intend to decide tonight. I settled into the wicker chair, my chair, the one positioned to face the western horizon, the one that has held the weight of every significant thought I have had on this property for 4 decades, and I put my feet on the ottoman and I looked at the sky. The sun was finishing its work on the horizon, painting the live oaks and the long lawn and the estate's pale stone facade in the gold and violet that Texas evenings achieve in the hour before full dark. The sky above was the deep, clear blue of a place without enough humidity to muddy it. The mockingbird I'd heard in the night was somewhere in the oaks, cycling through its inventory of stolen songs, and the sound of it in the jasmine air was the specific music of this place, not peaceful exactly, but mine. Belonging to itself and to me in the way that things belong when they have been shared and kept and fought for over a lifetime. I pressed 2 fingers to the inside of my wrist. My pulse was steady. The arrhythmia that had flickered through my chest for weeks, the physical register of fear maintained at low levels over long periods, was gone. My heart was doing precisely what it was designed to do, at precisely the rate it was designed to do it, without assistance or apology. I touched my pearls. The triple strand of South Sea, my grandmother's, lay against my collarbone with their familiar cool weight, and they were what they had always been, not a noose, but an inheritance. The weight of women who had stood in hard rooms and held their ground and passed something forward. The engagement ring was on the hall table inside, beside my vintage leather planner. I had taken it off while Thomas was on the phone with Raymond Coles's office, and I had set it on the table without ceremony, and I had not looked at it again. The gold and violet on the horizon deepened toward violet and then toward the first blue of night, and the mockingbird continued its cataloging, and the jasmine breathed its heavy sweetness into the dark air around me, and I sat in my wicker chair on the veranda of my father's house with my hands folded in my lap and my back straight and my sovereignty restored. I had sat in this chair through every season this estate had offered me. Through my father's death and my children's births and the 1,000 ordinary evenings of a life that had turned out to be built on a lie I hadn't known to look for. I was sitting in it still. The silence settled over the lawn and the live oaks and the pale stone of the house, and it was the silence of an estate in the late evening, full of its own history and its own weight and its own unfinished business, and it was mine. Entirely, uncontestably, finally mine. I exhaled slowly, and the jasmine came in with the next breath, and I let the Texas night do what Texas nights have always done on this veranda, hold everything quietly, for as long as it needs to be held. I had nowhere pressing to be. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?